Okay, thanks everyone. It's really lovely to be here and lovely to see you all here as well. But what I want to try and do in this session is talk a little bit about the research we've conducted, in part just to get people's thoughts on it, but also to try and sort of set the tone for the day, sort of contextualize some of the discussions, and also to try in a sense to kind of make the case for why the study of this kind of topic is important. And that's what I want to try and start by talking about, the question about Muslim leadership in the debate around Islam and science and religion and science more generally. Now, as Riyaz mentioned, I work in a department of sociology and social policy, and that's my academic background, rather than in theology or philosophy or any kind of humanities discipline. So that's the kind of language I speak. And so I'm going to just try and sort of contextualize this discussion in relation to the wider sort of scenario, because I work, as Riyaz mentioned, I cover a range of different areas from Islamophobia to the study of Islam in the UK, but also in the sphere of science communication and the public understanding of science. And I think within that particular sphere, which is a very secularized kind of domain, there often there's at best a kind of blank slate when it comes to discussions around Muslim responses to science. Quite often it's a lot worse than that. And I'll just start by sort of setting that background down. So this is actually from the study of Islamophobia that I know you won't be able to see the details of this particular slide. Don't worry too much about that. The survey of Islamophobia that I conducted in 2022. And in that survey, I included a range of different questions about how people see religion in the UK. Shall I try and zoom in a little? Hang on. I don't know if I can, but I'll talk through the numbers, so don't worry. The report is available for free PDF. But briefly speaking, what all these bar charts show is that the British public has a pretty negative opinion towards religion in general. You see this large blue blob that you can see on the sort of the second to bottom? That's a question about asking people whether religion brings more conflict than peace. And 71% of the British members of the public agree with that statement. So that's around pushing towards 3/4 of people thinking that religion is ultimately a kind of negative force in society. And similarly, when we ask questions about, this is a question that's a bit further up, whether religious people tend to be less rational than non-religious people, there's a fairly solid majority in favor when compared to those against that. So some 36.5% of people thinking that's the case compared to just 18% who disagree with that notion. And similarly, when we talk about science as well, the idea that science and religion are fundamentally incompatible, there's some 37% agreement with that compared with 25% disagreement. So there's a kind of general, at best, sort of suspicion of a worst outright hostility towards religious belief in the UK. And often that can manifest in specific animus towards Islam. So I was involved in a project prior to this one, looking at religion and science more generally. And that was involved interviewing people from all kinds of faiths and backgrounds, religious and non-religious, in the UK as well as in Canada. We're involved in this research still now in other countries too. And then what was striking in much of the UK research is the way that an apparent tension or total incompatibility between Islam and science was marked out by some of the participants. And I've got a couple of quotes from that, which I'll just quickly read out, which were not representative of the entire group of people, but a notable minority who singled out Islam as being a tradition that is fundamentally and universally antipathetic towards science and rationality. So many people would be saying things like, and I'll try and read this out while speaking into the mic, I think for any religion, I can see them being fairly open-minded and taking a science into account, but maybe certain religions don't, for example, Islam. And that was very, very common, people offhandedly saying, actually, Islam's kind of different to the others. And similarly, this assumption that whereas there's variety and variation in many religious traditions, within Islam there's a kind of universal sort of hostility towards science. This is another quote from the bottom saying, this starts with, the truth is in the Bible and we need to go and follow the Bible and it can't be challenged in some people's minds. And I know that's a very simplistic view of Christianity, but as far as Islam goes, that's how Muslims are required to view the world, the way it was written down 1,300 years ago. So the similar kind of notion that when it comes to Islam, there's a kind of generic similarity across the tradition, and that as a sort of generic opposition towards science more generally. And part of what I've been trying to do is sort of at best complicate, most often directly oppose that kind of supposition. Now, part of the way that that's been done has been by trying to study British Muslims' views and Muslims further afield. So here's another survey. Again, you won't be able to see it, so I'm going to talk it through, about Muslim responses to and views about the Quran. Well, we said the sacred writing here because we were asking lots of different people. This is from a survey conducted around, I think, 2016. And what this shows is the sharp variations in the way that scripture is read within British Muslim public. So I'm going to read some of it out because I realize you won't be able to see the tiny text. Where we can see some things that you would expect when asking Muslim members of the public to say that if you ask them that the Quran is not really the words of God, but the words of its human authors, then there's very strong disagreement with that. Some 48% being very strongly opposed compared to 0.8%, I think, who strongly agree with it. So very, very small numbers there. But at the same time, there's variation in ways that that's read. So when we say that the sacred writing, as we phrased it here, the spiritual truth is much more important than its factual accuracy, then there's quite a considerable majority in favor of that statement as opposed to those who would reject it, although there is a split of opinion. Some 14% strongly agreeing compared to 6.8% disagreeing. So you can see even from that the stereotype doesn't really hold. There's a variety of different views and opinions out there. And similarly, when you ask about very specific questions, I'm going to draw from some research, again, a bar chart, slightly more visible, but only marginally more so, from a colleague of mine who worked with me on the research into Islamophobia, someone called Amy Unsworth, who's based at University College London. And she, with the Faraday Institute, ran a survey of Muslim members of the public in the UK looking at evolution specifically and views about evolution as a subject. And you can see again I'm going to draw out some broad themes from this, but she asked various different questions, which I don't have time to really talk about. But you can see some strong variations. So if you ask there's strong, reliable evidence to support the theory of evolution, there's 38% agreement, slightly lower than it is for other religious traditions, but compared to 30.2%. But here's the striking thing, and this is the thing that I want to really zero in on before talking about the project, is that there's quite a lot of confusion. So if you ask the question, the Earth is less than 10,000 years old, which is a kind of perception that tends to emerge from young Earth creationism in Christian contexts more than in Muslim contexts, there's still some 12% agreement with that amongst Muslim publics. This is one of the weird things about doing surveys. You get interesting views like this. And this is something that seems to carry across the qualitative research as well, that amongst Muslim members of the public, there tends to be higher opposition to certain ideas like evolution, but also greater levels of confusion, more people saying they don't really know. It doesn't appear to be quite as salient to identity, a sort of boundary marker like it is in, say, Christian fundamentalist contexts in the US. And there's a certain gap about where people are actually getting their knowledge from. I have a colleague who did qualitative research on this and will be interviewing people who are Muslim, but then when talking about subjects like the origins of human life, would give a kind of account that was drawn from biblical tenets rather than from any kind of Islamic scriptural source. And so there's this kind of lingering and open question, which is what this project's trying to tease apart and challenge, is it the case, for example, that only those people who are less committed to Islamic tradition, Muslims who might describe themselves as Muslim, but less committed, more secularized, tend to be more accepting of notions like evolution, or is that not the case? And one of the ways we wanted to pick that apart is precisely by looking at figures of religious authority, because I think there's a complete blank when it comes to sociological research in this area. And it's sort of a gap in the wider discussion that where there's currently sort of myths being filled, as we've seen. So this is really where the project came from, in a sense. We wanted to sort of work through that. But first, I'll let Riyaz, do you want to say something about the situation in Islam in the UK and the kind of context for the research first, to move on to slides?
I'll be looking at when we were kind of designing our fieldwork and choosing the particular sectors of Muslim leadership in Britain to focus on in terms of the interviews that we conduct and the case study institutions. I think a unique feature of British Islam is the fact that we have upwards of 40 Islamic seminaries, generally called Darul Ulums, but also called the Hawda Ilmiya, or under different names, the Jamias, operating in the UK. And they could be considered as the chief producers of the ulama. The ulama are basically the learned elite in Islam, both male and female. An alim is a male religious scholar, an alima is a female religious scholar. And they bear the imprint of their colonial origins. In other words, the system itself was basically developed as a response to British colonial rule in the 19th century in the wake of the 1857 quote-unquote War of Independence. And it was a very successful system in that it proliferated across South Asia. Multiple seminaries were set up, and students were basically housed in a single building or an institution in which the teachers were there. Matriculation, graduation, end-of-year examinations all took place. So many of these features were actually borrowed from the British, and it was an innovation in the sense that it went against the centuries-old tradition of seeking out a teacher and studying individual texts with qualified teachers. And so effectively the traditions of the silsila and the isnad were institutionalized within a building, a single site. And it became a successful model because it was self-funded, and it was the administrators of the system were able to successfully preserve the scriptural and spiritual heritages of the tradition in a context in which Mughal patronage had been taken away, and in which there was British colonial rule, which often was seen to be antithetical or even generated by an animus towards Islamic faith tradition. The curriculum which is taught in these institutions is generally referred to as the Dars-e-Nizami curriculum. And it's actually an amalgam, it's adapted from an older, more cosmopolitan tradition established by the Farangi Mahal dynasty of scholars in Lucknow. And the reason I think that's relevant to this research project is because the curriculum, of the Farangi Mahal curriculum, iteration of that curriculum, generally can be divided between the manqulat and the ma'qulat. And so scholars who've studied the family of ulama at the Farangi Mahal, such as Francis Robinson, or others such as Professor Ron Jeeves, generally refer to the distinction in the curriculum as between these two rubrics, the ma'qulat and the manqulat. So the ma'qulat are the rational sciences, and science has a broad umbrella term. So if you think of chemistry, physics, or biology, but even broader topics such as philosophy or logic, they would fall under the rubric of the ma'qulat, the rational sciences. And that's led to what Professor Ibrahim Musa in America, in his excellent book, What is a Madrasa, has referred to as a republic of letters. And he contrasts that with what he terms a republic of piety. And so that's another key function of the Darul Ulum, in that it's not just about the disembodied transmission of knowledge. It's about deeper spiritual processes such as tarbiyah and tazkiyah, which is to do with character formation and spiritual purification. And effectively what he argues is that there's been a transition from a republic of letters to a republic of piety. And so this begs the broader question of what is the function of a Darul Ulum in 21st century Britain? In that, is it to produce pious individuals who are moral exemplars, or is it to produce academics and intellectuals who are able to engage, effectively function as an interface between the text and the context? And so the thing which characterizes the Darul Ulum sector is its fidelity to these ancient scriptural sources, the manqulat, which is basically the Quran, the Hadith, the sciences of fiqh, tajweed. These things are studied, seerah, in quite a lot of detail. But what tends to happen, and I've got a quote here from Philip Lewis, who's a scholar of Islam in Britain. It's quite an old quote, 1994. He published a book called Islamic Britain. And what he suggested is that what seems evident is that the students of these institutions in the UK live in two unrelated linguistic and cultural worlds. And it's quite interesting because I know we've got quite a few graduates, alumni of the Darul Ulum system in the crowd. So, it'd be very interesting to have your take on this. But he said that there seems to be neither coordination nor consultation between the staff who teach the Dunyawi, i.e. the worldly syllabus in English, in the afternoon, and those who teach the Arabic Islamic course in the morning through the medium of Urdu. So that's quite interesting because you can see this bifurcation, this polarization. So if you go back to the ma'qulat and the manqulat, the language itself becomes a symbol. So the English language is basically symbolizing the ma'kulat, the Urdu language is symbolizing the mankulat, and the binary between the deen and the dunya is again reflected in the division between the ma'kulat and the mankulat. And he goes on to give an example. In the morning, the students may study lessons from Islam in Urdu by Mufti Kifayatullah and read about the miracles wrought by the Prophet, including splitting the moon, based on Surah 54:1 of the Quran. This is interpreted literally. In the afternoon, they'll study general science in English. A possible discordance between these two worlds is neither acknowledged nor addressed. Now, that was 30 years ago in 1994, and I think it would be difficult to make a blanket assertion about the sector as a whole today. And I think one of the things that we found through our fieldwork is that it's actually a sector in evolution, if you forgive the pun. But there's actually many organic bottom-up processes of change that are taking place. I actually conducted fieldwork as part of this project in a case study institution, a male Darul Ulum, in which I had focus groups with students, and I conducted interviews with several teachers. And the interesting thing which I found is the science teacher who I interviewed was actually a qualified science teacher before he became an alim, before he undertook traditional seminary studies. And so he had an undergraduate degree in physics, he had a PGCE, and he taught in state schools for several decades. And then he consciously made a decision to transition into the Darul Ulum sector and to train as an alim. So I think that's a very different picture to the one which was presented by Philip Lewis, which may have been true 30 years ago, and it may still be true in certain segments of the sector. But based upon our fieldwork, I think we have discovered a considerable degree of internal heterogeneity, of diversity within the sector. So I think it's difficult to make those blanket assertions. What we found is that individual graduates are forging their own trajectories, which in turn reflexively impact back upon the institutions. I think the pace of change may be slower within the institutions, but graduates, once they leave the institution, then often undertake their own personal journeys. And then the extent to which they are able to impact the institutions differs. Sometimes they end up, quote unquote, burning bridges if they seem to be too radical. But on other occasions, they actually end up becoming teachers inside these institutions. So even that binary between the Urdu and the English dissolves because they're now teaching in English, the Islamic elements of the course, and they're bringing their life experiences to bear on that. We've also seen the emergence of a number of bridging institutions. For example, the Cambridge Muslim College, White Thread Institute, Ibrahim College, Al-Balagh Academy, which are basically attempting to function as an interface between the ma'kulat and the mankulat. So they evince a fidelity to the basic scriptural canon of Islam, but they're outwardly oriented in that they're looking to have this conversation with contemporary issues to do with science and philosophy. We've also seen exploratory discussions between seminaries and universities about accreditation, which I think is an important development because that basically means that graduates are no longer functioning in an isolated bubble in which they struggle to translate their rigorous theological training in terms which can be accessible in mainstream educational circles. And finally, perhaps all of this signals a pendulum shift back towards the ma'kulat from the mankulat. So I think it's very much a work in progress and it's a situation in evolution. But I think what we can safely say is that it's difficult to make blanket statements about the sector as a whole because there's a lot of internal heterogeneity. Thank you. I'll hand back over to Stephen.
Okay, and it's really in relation to that context that the research comes about. We're going to give a brief summary of it now, potted necessarily because I don't want to take up too much time, but hopefully something we can perhaps expand upon in other discussions as we need to. Just to kind of give a sort of sense of the breadth, we've got a lovely flyer on the right there, which we've used less than we probably should have done. So it involves 40 interviews with either British Muslim religious leaders or kind of leaders in training, people studying for some kind of alim qualification or something similar, as well as visits to 4 Islamic educational institutions, a variety of different types, different kind of denominational affiliations, for want of a better term, as well as 5 focus groups with students, boys and girls, and adults sometimes as well, within those institutions. And so we tried to reach across, as far as we were able, the sort of full diversity of Muslim Britain, including Shia, Barelvi, Deobandi, Salafi to some extent. That was a little bit of a struggle, and then Al-Mahdi Muslims as well as others too. Saleema might have a slightly clearer read on that than me. And we also sought to reach a range of ethnicities within that research, as well as male and female Muslim leaders who, I think the roughly 2/3 male to 1/3 female was the split in the end as it came about in our interviews. So a kind of a wide, broad range, and not just sort of including those from a more progressive side, for want of a better term, or conservative, but covering across that just to kind of get as wide a picture as we possibly can. And so first thing we were kind of interested to find out about is this really an issue that people talk about within the context of Islamic educational institutions? And honestly, when I wrote the proposal for this with Riyaz some years ago now, I honestly didn't know if we were going to find any interest or any discussions that were going on this subject at all. Because from the research literatures out there, you wouldn't have thought so. But actually we found an awful lot, a whole wealth of discussion going on in different institutions, which some of you may be more familiar with than I was. But we found direct discussions of a variety of different themes within science, as broadly construed as one can. Some modules on subject of Islam in science in one institution, learning materials in another, research fellows dedicated to the subject, a range of different discussions and events going on that really I wouldn't say I didn't expect it, but I genuinely didn't know what to expect. So it was, in a sense, a kind of pleasant surprise. And I've got a few flyers from various different events, one of which, the one in the middle, we've organised. So that's a bit of a cheat there. That's us doing the research we're part of. But still, that's something that really struck us. And we found what you might say, this is perhaps one of the main themes of the research. If there's one theme to sort of try and pull out, an increasing level of candour and clarity, maybe even consilience about these particular subjects, a willingness to sort of open up discussions about sometimes even quite sensitive topics. Sometimes topics, certainly in the view of some of our interviewees, would have said that, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, this topic, i.e. human evolution, might have been taboo to discuss, and now it's something that we can discuss a little bit more openly. Again, I think that reflects some of the changes that Riyaz was talking about a moment ago, and the sort of ongoing changes within British Muslim communities and institutions, and a sort of general sense that there's a need to address the questions of and the needs of younger Muslims who are negotiating secular spaces, and in particular the kind of suspicions and hostilities that I spoke about earlier. It's one of our interviewees saying people are really thirsty for this type of information. So we have panels on these subjects, but I'm just going to quickly sketch through some of the findings we found. So firstly, on the question of evolution, we can say quite concretely, if you have this kind of stereotype of a universe, a sort of monolith of Islamic positions on different scientific subjects, there were a wide variety of perspectives, ranging from kind of acceptance of human evolution to a sort of what I think Shoaib Malik, who's going to be joining us remotely later, I think, talks about Adamic evolution, the idea that evolution continued, but with Adam being sort of inserted in that process at some point, through to a sort of a kind of human exceptionalist perspective where biological evolution is broadly accepted in animal species, but with the exception of humans being viewed as sort of special and set apart. Some of the questions I have here sort of illustrating those three here. So sort of personally, I don't find it disturbing to come from a line of animal evolution. Others saying, when it comes to human beings, there seems to be a miraculous origin point. We also wanted to have a look at, investigate the notion of the scientific miracle of the Quran. See about that, because there's some writing out there in the academic sphere and the wider public world that seems to suggest this is hugely and widely popular across Muslim communities, but nothing really known about scholarly context, whether this is an idea that has any kind of real purchase. And the basic, I'm simplifying slightly, but the basic message from there is not really. It seems to be a kind of narrative that has some sort of popular appeal, a kind of televangelists like a Knight there, really kind of sort of putting that out, especially to younger people who sometimes said, I used to get a bit drunk on this kind of discourse when I was younger, and now I'm starting to move away from it. But much less so within scholarly context amongst ulama. Nearly all of them, with a couple of exceptions, saying, I'll just read one quote here. You read these books about scientific miracles in the Quran, and then when you actually think about or know a bit about science, some of these things are very shaky. A deep skepticism of the idea. Sometimes a kind of sense that, yes, there is genuinely a miraculous nature of this in the Quran. There's a kind of softer version, perhaps, a sense that there's a profound meaning in it, but not the kind of systematic attempt to discover kind of miracles line by line. That seemed to be much less prominent, with the exception of, I should say, the interviewees we encountered who were, if not necessarily identifying as Salafis, from within that kind of wider context of dawah and trying to sort of propagate Islam. Seemed to be much more popular and prominent a theme there, and also in the Ahmadi context, which I have to admit I'm not an expert on that particular tradition. That was one that I did not expect to find. Okay, in the question, the more fundamental thing though, and this kind of comes back to the kind of increasing candor issue, what was interesting to me is less the kind of that there was a variety of opinions, because there is a variety of opinions within the Muslim community on nearly everything I've encountered, so that didn't really surprise me. What was more interesting, I think, is there's a kind of opening of interpretive space. There's less an interest in sort of defining this is the right position, and more on trying to sketch out a space within which we can have conversations about the interpretation of the Quran and what that means, how we think about the origin of the human species. That was much more often something that people would emphasize, rather than I think this is right, well that is right. It's more about how do we think about the Quran as a text, and how do we sort of read that into what we think about science. And now I'm going to move to Saleema, who's going to talk a bit about the themes within what we call Islam and science in everyday life.
So I'm going to bring to you some of the on-the-ground research findings that we came across, and more in relation to applied science topics. So in addition to the more abstract philosophical and religious approaches to science, we explored participant attitudes to current applied science topic. We asked questions like, in your role as a religious leader or leader in training, have you encountered difficult questions about whether particular scientific applications are halal or haram? And if so, which sources of information do you turn to? Would you turn to scientific, in inverted commas, specialists or religious specialists? Are you aware of active debates, either in Muslim communities or amongst religious leaders, on these issues? And on this particular point, we're very happy to report that it seems the use of WhatsApp and Telegram is a must for today's alim or alima. We prompted with discussion of issues like COVID guidelines, stem cell technology, IVF, organ donation, amongst others, things that affected religious observance. And we selected these because we believed that these are the issues that are being spoken about today. Now, considering, as Stephen mentioned, that the paths of science and religion rarely cross in modern Western discourse, a unique hallmark of our discussions was that scholars very purposefully referred to both science and religion as sources of information and knowledge in making these decisions on applied science. And I quote one of our respondents who said, a female scholar, she said, I think it's very important that as Muslims, we look at the ethics of these areas, not just from a perspective of science, but also from a perspective of Islamic core values. And moving on to specific topics, the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has taken over our lives in the past few years. It raised questions of science application for religious communities, and the sheer volume of discussion meant that we had to address this. What we found, however, didn't contain any surprises, and the guidance of religious leaders, we feel, can be characterized as considered, practical, and largely in line with government guidelines. Congregations, for example, were encouraged to explore religious prescriptions around praying in their front rooms, around keeping 2 meters between individuals in prayer, and so on and so forth. And we found no evidence of conflict even around the question of to jab or not to jab, which has been a huge conversation in some other religious circles. And there was almost near consensus that the vaccine is a good thing. Of course, it helped the developers were a Turkish Muslim couple. And this is a sentiment best explained by another one of our scholars in training, when he said, when the vaccine came up, it wasn't even a conversation, and he kind of did this. And he said it was just like, when are you having yours? That's it. In fact, some of the scholars we spoke to emphasized that it was necessary to protect others, and they quoted the well-known hadith, La darar wa la dirar, and I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, which can be paraphrased, we shouldn't be harmed or cause harm to others. A few went even further, and they had actually exhorted their communities to take the vaccine and spoke up vociferously against conspiracy theories. A small minority of our respondents judged it to be halal, but they didn't go as far as recommending it. And when I pressed them as to why they wouldn't recommend the vaccine, they said, well, science is changeable. It's not an absolute, is it? And again, I refer to one of our respondents and quote, and he said that I think with COVID, it was almost a spiritual decision to take the vaccine because I thought that as a believer, my presence can't physically endanger other people. And one of my favorite sayings, and this is a well-known female scholar, she said to me, the lab is a pulpit of worship for me. And again, if you see here, the convergence of religious and scientific terminology. The vaccine does not contradict my values at all. There are a lot of conspiracy theories out there on politicians, on the economy, on this and that. I don't think it's about religion. Moving on to organ donation after death, the recent transition here in the UK back in May 2020 to an opt-in system has meant that both religious and medical professionals have had to deal with questions such as, does my faith allow me to donate organs after death? Would this constitute bodily desecration? Can I take organs from non-Muslims? And so forth. Here, as Stephen and Riyaz have mentioned, we found a healthy, nuanced, and in-depth discussion. The vast majority of participants were aware of the wider debate around organ donation, and we have some very experienced people in the room here today on this subject, and they were partially aware of some named scholars in the field. About half had actually done their own research and made up their own mind, while the rest had actually not given it much thought. However, when it came to their personal decisions on organ donation, we encountered a range of views, both amongst ulama, the seasoned scholars, but also amongst the young people. What we did find is that younger ulama and ulama in training were kind of on the fence. They knew about the debate, they were aware of the discussions, but they hadn't quite made up their mind. And I've got a quote here which really illustrates that. When I was speaking to a female scholar, she very emphatically said, I've been to all the conferences and I've been to the seminars and I believe organ donation after death is just fine. But then when I pressed her and said, so if you were in a position or a loved one was in a position where you needed an organ, would you then take it? And she went quiet. She said, I'm not sure how I would feel personally. I do need to think about that personally, but theoretically, I think it can be allowed. So there's a little bit of sort of dissonance here between what people believe or speak about in a general way, but when the practice comes to what they would do if they were put in that difficult situation, a lot of the people we spoke to were still thinking about it. And the most common refrain on organ donation is, we found, is I just follow Dr. Mansour Ali from Cardiff. There was an interested and quite unanticipated conversation we found around religious leaders' concerns related to issues of gender and sexuality in Muslim communities. And this led us to include this in our research agenda when it wasn't there originally. So we found that there is a growing urgency amongst ulama across the country in a variety of settings, but especially in community-facing fields, to address the questions and the needs of younger Muslims, even younger scholars. And they admitted, the ulama did, to feeling unable to address these issues. And they also said that they did not understand the science that is often quoted to justify these positions. The experience of religious leaders whom we spoke to ranged from a confident assertion that, and I quote, the God-given view is one of the genders being of equal status and equal stature. Excuse me. However, and I'm still quoting, complementary and completely different. I am now brave enough to say that yes, men and women have different roles and functions in society. On the other hand, we had a very candid reflection from another scholar, and she said, I don't know enough about the literature or the science or whatever, what it's saying either way. This is a difficult one. And I guess we keep coming back to this question of why talk about science and religion at all? Why talk about Islam and science? And we found, thankfully, a lot of justification in our fieldwork for talking about this issue. A significant number of participants expressed the realization that scholars of religion need to better understand modern scientific contexts in order to address the issues that we've been talking about, particularly community-facing ulama and younger scholars in training who are navigating secular spaces on a daily basis. Within these spaces, very frequently, they are challenged, they encounter Islamophobia and prejudice. A number of scholars, and this came as a surprise to us, were actually very worried about young Muslims leaving their faith behind on issues related to science and rationality. Combined with this, a few also shared that they didn't feel equipped to address these issues. And I quote, "I think it's really important for scholars to keep in touch with what's happening in the world and the contextual lived realities. Often we find that's what's missing." Another female scholar and a lecturer in the mainstream higher education system told me, "We're very good at knee-jerking and then thinking about it afterwards. What we need to do is what true Islamic scholarship does. We need to think, reflect, consider, and discuss. Discuss with the experts in the field, whether they are Muslim or non-Muslim. An expert in the field is an expert in the field." And finally, we found disturbing evidence, and again, this was fairly unprecedented, and Stephen's done a lot more research on this than we have, evidence of anti-religion and Islamophobic prejudice, particularly directed at Muslim professionals in STEM and scientific fields. And this is confirming earlier research that Stephen mentioned that was conducted by our colleagues at the University of Birmingham. Unfortunately, it also seemed to be at the highest levels and worse amongst highly educated and elite scientific communities, with it being less prevalent in sort of junior and less entitled professional colleagues. Predictably, and I think some of you in the room can relate to this, the most frequent references to prejudice came from women who looked Muslim and wore the headscarf. And I quote a female scientist here. She is the first to do a PhD in her family. And she says that I would say I'm misjudged because the association of religion and science don't go hand in hand. How can you be a scientist and believe in theories about religion and God? And when I pressed her and asked her about the reasons, or what she thought were the reasons for this misrepresentation and this prejudice, she said, it's the lack of Muslims in the field, a lack of information surrounding religion and science, and a lack of people in higher positions. Finally, we would like to say that findings such as these make it imperative that we continue to research and develop an evidence base for what Muslims actually believe when it comes to Islam and science, to tackle misinformation, a lack of information, and even outright hostility and prejudice. But we're very pleased also to report that what we observed is a significant opening up of these spaces and a real nuance in the conversation on these issues. As Stephen has emphasized, the most valuable point is not necessarily the views that we encountered, but the way in which they were held and discussed. There was an openness to discussion and changed views and a willingness to engage with competing views. And I leave you again with the quote that we shared earlier of one of our respondents when he said that people are really thirsty for this type of information. And we would like to report that we've come a long way in the past 15 to 25 years from the events around the excommunication of Osama Hassan, because he spoke up and spoke what were at that time quite radical views around evolution, the pseudo-censorship of Harun Yahya, and I'm also pleased to report that many of our younger scholars have never heard of him, which is fantastic, to the present situation where we have a growth in innovative spaces for these debates. Thank you.